Hello everyone. I'm Julia Jessen. I'm the Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. Thank you for joining me today for this Grant Wood in Focus presentation. This is a series of Zoom presentations that we do at the CRMA that look at varying aspects of Grant Wood's life and career. And today I'll be focusing on a grouping of portraits that Grant Wood created that depict women. This does feel particularly appropriate for this month. It is Women's History Month. And this is an interesting grouping of portraits as well. They span the course of just a few years. And of course, there are many Grant Wood works that feature women. And he often used people that he knew as the basis for these figures. But these four works are all portraits of a single female figure with no other figures present. They span 1929 to 1933, which was also a very important time in his career as he was realizing his mature style. And there are interesting connections between these pieces that we can discuss as we go along. So today I'll be focusing primarily on Portrait of Frances Fiske Marshall from 1929, Woman with Plants, also from 1929, Victorian Survival from 1931, and Portrait of Nan from 1933. And before we kind of jump in and start discussing the portrait of Frances Fiske Marshall, I did want to touch briefly on another portrait of another young lady that comes a bit earlier and I think might set us up a bit for this discussion and conversation. So this is the portrait of Sally Staymates from 1927. This is one of Grant Wood's earliest and often considered one of his most sensitive portraits. During this time period in the 20s, he's transitioning from being a teacher to becoming a full-time artist. He had resigned from his teaching positions that he held in 1919 to 1925 with the encouragement of his patron and landlord, David Turner. He began taking on commissions, and in this case, particularly portrait commissions, and they provided a revenue stream that allowed him to make a living and also be able to support his mother and his sister. And eventually doing things like this and earning money this way also allows him to create work that was not made for commission. He could explore a little bit more in that way. There was also many members of the Cedar Rapids community that were actively fostering the arts in the city, and in turn would help artists like Grant Wood or like his friend Marvin Cohn to be able to establish themselves as professional artists. So in this case, with this commission, he's painting Sally Staymates in the family home. She's holding a block in her hand with an S to represent her name. We can also notice the wallpaper behind her. The pattern and the colors are reflected in the embroidery on her collar. It's one of these details that Wood often used that kind of show his interest in the decorative and these decorative elements in his work. And clothing in Wood's portraits, such as this one, were often stylized and kind of indicated something about the person's lifestyle or about the sitter's way of life and what they were doing. This portrait feels very kind of lifelike. There's a life and vitality to the portrait, kind of a shine and a sparkle in the eyes of Sally, and a rosy glow to the cheeks as if she's just sat down after playing very hard for a while. She gazes to the left of the viewer, like a child needing to be distracted to stay still. And even her position, which you're seeing a detail of here with a leg through the arm of the chair, rather than sitting straight on, feels true to life, like a child who's allowed to be depicted as a child, rather than a perfectly idealized representation. Mrs. Herbert Staymates would recall, quote, "When we asked Grant Wood in 1927 to paint our 14-month-old daughter, Sally, he was reluctant. He told us this would be his first oil portrait. When he finally agreed to paint Sally, the financial arrangement was interesting. Grant said, 'If I let you have it, the cost will be $25. If you like it very well, $50. If I like it, $75. We paid $75, and he wanted the portrait sent to Chicago for framing. The company there wanted to buy it, and the framing bill came to $100. End quote. The Staymates did hang on to the portrait and passed it on to Sally, who would eventually gift it to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. This portrait and its success then would kind of spur others to request portraits to be done by Grant Wood. And it would become the first in about a half dozen commissioned portraits that Wood would complete in his lifetime. There are additional examples of this kind of portraiture of children, where we see again this kind of very sensitively rendered subject matter, showing them as the children that they are. One of these is Master Gordon Fennell, where we see kind of a childlike joy and excitement that's present in the sitter. This was commissioned by John C. Reed and presented to Mr. and Mrs. Gordon Fennell and represents their son. The senior Gordon Fennell was president of the Gordon Fennell Company. And this is a very sensitive portrayal of their young son here. Another example of these childlike portraits is Plaid Sweater and the depiction of Mel Bloomberg, where this slightly older child looks a bit surly at having to come inside to sit for his portrait rather than being out playing football. And so these portraits and seeing kind of this earlier portrait with Sally Staymates and then what he would go on to do with some of these other works leads us into talking about the portrait of Francis Fiske Marshall from 1929. And to further set up what was going on during this time and kind of what led to this portrait, Wood had already been to Europe multiple times, and his last trip prior to this would have been in 1928, where he went to supervise the making of the stained glass for the Veterans Memorial window that was taking place in Munich, Germany. And during this time, there were a lot of different influences that would end up impacting the rest of his work. And one of these was actually seeing this process of the stained glass manufacturing. It kind of sparked this delight, this joy in that very detailed, kind of exacting craftsmanship, which was something that he hadn't been doing as much of with his impressionist work that he'd been doing through the 20s. So that one kind of influence that's coming through and that we'll see in other works by the artist. And also on this trip, he was spending time in museums. He was looking at the paintings that they held there. Often ones that would kind of spark his interest would be these Northern Renaissance, kind of late Gothic images that he was seeing from artists like Hans Memling. Here you're seeing a couple of portraits, which again, Memling and his influence would be very important for Wood moving forward. But he was also looking at people like Hans Holbein and Albrecht Dürer. And these would be different artists that he would be seeing at these different museums as he was in Munich. He was also experiencing the style of German art that was popular during this time in the 1920s, what his contemporaries were doing. And this was something called Neue Sachlichkeit, which is new objectivity, is what that means. This is a style that's characterized by a harder edged painting. It was something that was popular in 1920s Germany, where there was a broader return to realism or objectivity and stability, and to a certain extent, classical order that followed World War I and the chaos and destruction of that time period. There could also be sort of a reaction against the German expressionism that had been prevalent in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And so they were kind of eschewing that expressionistic romantic exploration, looking at exotic cultures and the inner psychology that was popular with German expressionism. And instead, they were looking at realistic representations of their modern surroundings. And these artists, too, were looking at these 15th century Northern Gothic painters, the ones that we just were looking at. And those painters were enjoying this big surge of popularity during this time. So Grant Wood, too, was admiring the same painters that his German contemporaries of the time period were looking at. And these things would be really influential on his output moving forward. But he didn't jump automatically to an entirely different style. He kind of slowly mulling over what he's seen. He's thinking about how he can incorporate these different influences and references in a way that made sense for him and his art in this space and in this state. And portraiture would be where some of this mature style would first start to come through. He did work in various styles throughout the 1920s, like I mentioned, but that hard-edge style is something that we can see in the portraiture work, which, due to the nature of the subject matter, where it's supposed to be a little bit more true to life than other genres of painting, it kind of lends itself automatically to a tighter, more controlled kind of style of painting. So during the year after he returned from Munich, He continued his decorative commissions and painting 2 or 3 straight society portraits, and also continued composing canvases in his impressionistic style as well. And Francis Fiske Marshall is one of these portraits that he composed during this time, during that year after coming back from Munich. The number of portraits like this, these kind of half-length portraits, would increase during these years immediately following his visit to Germany. This portrait was commissioned by Vern Marshall, who was the Cedar Rapids Gazette editor, and he would later go on to become a Pulitzer Prize winner himself. It represents his wife, who had died of a sudden illness at 33 years old and left 4 young daughters behind. So, feeling regret that he hadn't commissioned a portrait during life, Vern approached their friend Grant Wood and asked him to paint her portrait from memory and using a few photographs. He was thinking of it as a way to memorialize Frances so that her daughters would be able to remember her. The couple, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall, were among the early friends and sponsors of the artist, and he provided him with a little miniature of her portrait so that he'd be able to start working on the piece. His sister, Grant Wood's sister, Nan Wood Graham, would remember that Grant was hesitant to accept the commission because he typically didn't care to paint really beautiful women. But Marshall prevailed on him, and he was greatly pleased with the outcome that resulted from this painting. It's one of only 2 portraits that the artist painted after the subject's death. And if we think about it in comparison to the portraits of the children that we were looking at before that were done from life, we just saw, there's a feeling of greater separation here between the viewer and the subject of this portrait. She looks out at us just slightly to our right. She does feel a little bit more idealized and perfected, perhaps seen through a lens of time and memory rather than having the immediacy and vitality of some of his other portraits. She's depicted as very fashionable and young, and the vibrancy of her shawl contrasts with how she is depicted. The light hits her shoulder area and draws the eye to the shawl and its pattern, which again, showing that interest that Wood had in the decorative patterning throughout his work. In fact, he was so interested in that and so kind of enamored with the shawl that he would use it as inspiration for the design that he incorporated on the frame that he made for the piece. So you can see here a detail of the edging of the frame where he's created this patterning, which is sort of meant to echo the design of the shawl. It's not an exact replica, but kind of meant to play off of that design of the shawl. There's still a looseness that's present in this portrait. The depiction of the shawl fringe gets looser toward the bottom and seems to kind of meld together or disappear, or even sort of swoosh upward in this curve at the bottom of the picture plane. Frances sits with her hands together delicately in her lap. She seems sort of casual and comfortable, yet dignified. And the painting here hints strongly at this mature style that we've been mentioning and talking about, hints of what he's going to move into and become best known for. This painting would end up being shared by Frances's 4 daughters when they grew up. They would send it between themselves to all 4 of their different homes, and kind of every so often would transfer it to another sister. And then eventually they donated it to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. So from here, where we're seeing kind of these first few hints of the mature style that he's moving into, we can then go to Woman with Plants from 1929. And this is one of his first works where he's really starting to move into this style that's influenced by these things that he was seeing in Germany and seeing from these artists that he saw while there. Wood would say in 1932, quote, "There I found myself experiencing a reaction against so-called modernism and felt myself strongly drawn toward rationalism. It appeared that the modernists went to the primitives for inspiration. I wondered if I could anticipate what was to follow. It seemed to me the Gothic painters were the next step. I had always admired them, especially Memling, who I had studied assiduously. To me then, the Gothic seemed the line of advancement. So I retained what I thought was lasting in the modernistic movement, and it added storytelling quality as a logical opposition to abstraction." End quote. And so here, Wood is not just looking back to look back, but in a way, he's sort of looking backward to move forward. He's thinking about what comes next. What is the next style? What should he move into? And that's what leads him to these artists of the late Gothic there. As his style is changing, as he's incorporating these elements of storytelling into his work, he's also trying to make sure that he's not becoming too illustrative, making sure that the pieces can kind of stand for themselves and the titles don't have to do a lot of work and become these illustrations in that way. So he leans instead on decorative elements. He looks at painting types rather than individuals. He's thinking about these decorative possibilities in the contemporary clothing and the objects that he includes. And through this process and through experimentation and kind of mulling over what he had seen, he realizes that he wants to focus on the homes, the landscapes, and people that surrounded him in the Midwest, rather than on the things that he had seen in Europe or even on scenes that he saw in Iowa that reminded him of Europe. And so in this work, we've got the previous kind of visible brushstrokes and dappled sunlight of his impressionist works. Here they're replaced, and there's a smooth kind of surface and a new solidness to his forms, to his trees, to his hills, to his figures. He's even imitating the techniques of those artists that he was looking at from the Gothic. So 7 or 8 coats of glazes were applied to this piece on composition board and several coats of varnish. So he's thinking about that as well. Even that Renaissance portrait style, where there's stiffened outlines, the face has descriptive detail, but the costume is sort of simple and decorative pattern. All lessons that he was learning from these artists. It's also that half-length seated figure against that landscape in the background, which feels very kind of reminiscent of those Memling portraits that we were looking at. And he didn't hesitate to borrow from the ideas of these different periods, looking toward the Renaissance. And in the past, he had looked at influences from academic art, from Art Nouveau, and from Impressionism as well. So he's always thinking about and drawing on these different eras. Prior to that trip to Munich, he had done some portrait work on commission, like we talked about, but portraiture hadn't played a huge role in his work. And after the trip, it would become this recurring theme where he was able to kind of tease out that mature style. And it would play a huge role, of course, in some of his most famous works. I want to talk more about this piece, but before we do, I wanted to touch briefly on another portrait painted kind of just before this one, John B. Turner, Pioneer. This is the first figural work in which Wood tried to capture this idea of the Midwesterner, this very distinctive character type that he felt had developed out of the struggle to conquer the frontier. And it's one of his first successful paintings in this new style that he's working on. It's very highly delineated and meticulously detailed, and showing a scene of everyday people and life that are centered around his Iowa home. He ended up winning first prize for portraiture at the Iowa State Fair in 1929 with this work. And what he's done here is he's juxtaposed the portrait of a prominent businessman, the father of his patron, David Turner, with an 1869 Lynn County map, a reference to the relationship between place and identity, and a symbol of this frontier that the figure was instrumental in developing. John B. Turner was one of Wood's first patrons and financed his trip to Europe, and then provided him with studio space and commissions as well. The sitter himself called the painting, quote, 2 old maps. And so here, what we see with Woman with Plants, he's depicted an image of his elderly mother, Hattie, who was about 69 or 70 at the time. She looks far off to the left, kind of less engagement with the viewer than what we've seen in some of these previous portraits. She feels very specific to his mother. We see there is this very strong resemblance between the photograph of his mother and the painted depiction, but at the same time, she's made sort of monumental. She's made to sort of stand in for this type that he's thinking about and looking at. It's a very tightly rendered portrait with a more loose background. And I'll show you some details here. There we go. Still hard-edged. We see her lined face and hands that give the painting that sort of specificity. We feel as if we know this person, like we've seen her before. And he gives special emphasis to elements of her face and to her hands, and to the wedding band on the hands as well. She's wearing a cameo brooch at her neck there. And the cameo seems a little bit more abstract in its depiction. She almost contrasts with the cameo figure in kind of the specificity of her depiction, but also she becomes like a symbolic cameo figure herself through the representation that Wood is doing here. This was an actual cameo that belonged to the sitter. It was something that Grant Wood had brought back from Europe for her as a present. And Nan Wood Graham, his sister, would end up wearing the same brooch when she modeled for American Gothic in the following year. There are soft forms that are present in the figural representation that are then picked up also by the brooch, by the earrings that she's wearing, the plump begonia leaves, which are off to her right there. We see that in the detail on the lower half of the screen. And the treetops, the rolling hills, and the sails of the windmill that are behind her in the landscape depiction. She holds a snake plant in a pot there, very close to her body, cradling it protectively. And we also see a sharp contrast between the white rickrack on her apron and the dark background of her dress that she wears below it. The plant here is slightly off center in the pot and seems almost to curve to the contours of the sides of her face. The pattern on the plant itself, this kind of zigzag that's present, feels like it sort of mimics the rickrack that we see on the apron that she wears. There's something of a wistful feeling here, kind of a melancholy that's present. We see on her hand this ring that she's wearing, perhaps a symbol of her nature as being very kind of faithful and very stalwart in that way. In the background, let's see a few more details here. In the background, we have this very customary loose brushwork. It's very stylized in contrast with how the figure appears more naturalistic. The colors that we see there make it seem as if it's an autumnal background, perhaps symbolic of a rich and full life that's now nearing its close. We see a river off to the right in the background, snaking its way through the fertile valley. And that too seems to kind of mimic that zigzag that we see in the snake plant and in the rickrack on the trim of her apron as well. Here he's combining these observable details that he's seeing in her hands and face with that deliberate stylization and patterning in the woman's dress in the background. It's a painting that feels like it is about the Midwest. The background is very typically Iowa, and even the colors of the land kind of tie her to that land itself. So they're repeated in the figure. We see that her eyes appear to be the same color as the sky. Her hands almost feel like they mimic the color of the shocks of corn in the background. And her apron seems similar to the color of the hills that are rolling behind her. He's represented here the valley where she has spent her whole life, where she's lived for her entire life. Here he's thinking about embodying this idea of the Midwesterner, very similar to the John B. Turner pioneer portrait. Embodying this idea of kind of strength and determination, and a little bit of austerity too from her sort of background that's coming through. It feels very specific in how it's being represented, but at the same time, she's somewhat idealized and depersonalized to make her into this kind of monumental figure that represents a certain type or a certain kind of person. It becomes this kind of archetypal portrait of Midwesternness. She wears old-fashioned clothing, very kind of country rural garb, as a way of showing her as being connected to this earlier era and having made it out, sort of showing her as a survivor who's made it through and becomes this kind of symbol for pioneer women. He's telling her story through those lines on her face, through the specificity that he's using in those details to indicate who she is and kind of the story of her life. As John Stuart Curry would say, quote, "He could make one face in a picture represent and interpret the lives and souls of a whole group of people," end quote. Even the snake plant becomes kind of a symbol to represent something about her. And that too was a very sort of 15th century portraiture kind of idea, where they would include attributes which would mean something about the sitter. And oftentimes in those portraits, the attributes that they held or that were near them, sitting on a table or something like that, oftentimes they would be very easily understood by a viewer. They would be easy to tell, oh, okay, that means this about them. In Grant Wood's work, they could be a little bit more ambiguous. There's much more discussion about what some of these different things mean and different interpretations that come through. But oftentimes for this portrait, the snake plant is read as something that's showing hardiness. The plant is known for its hardiness. And so it seems to indicate the sitter's resilience and the strength of her character, which were things that Wood associated with his mother, but also with this general idea of the Midwestern pioneer. It's also interesting as a plant that also appears prominently in the Neue Sacklichkeit images as well. So something that's reoccurring in those pieces too. The plant itself appears to be in very good health. It seems nourished by the Iowa landscape, by the sun, by the rich soil, but also it's enjoyed the benefits of her care, kind of tirelessly caring for it. And she cradles it in that way to show that care as well. It attests to her skills as a gardener, but also as a person as well. And there are additional plants in the foreground that also kind of lean into that interpretation. It's possible that we could also think of the snake plant as a stand-in for the artist himself, as another figure who has benefited from her care, and in that way represents the snake plant in the piece. This painting was the first work of his to be accepted by the jury for the annual exhibition of American painting and sculpture at the Art Institute of Chicago. So he got some critical success from this piece. But also the local community really supported it too. People liked this direction that he was moving in, and encouraged him to continue in this vein, to sort of move away from some of these subjects of Europe that he had been focusing on and instead depict the local landscape and people. Even one commenter kind of likened this to a Mona Lisa with an Iowa landscape. And there is a compositional similarity between this piece and something like the Mona Lisa, where she's sort of exalted up even through the portraiture, through that portraiture style. It's still a piece where he's experimenting. He's still figuring things out. He hasn't kind of fully realized what his mature style is. But he's figuring out a way to dignify this Midwestern experience through his art. In 1937, he said, quote, "I decided to paint life as it is. Well, I went home to Iowa and found my mother in the kitchen cooking. In her apron, I saw just as paintable decorative material as the old painter's hat. When I painted the picture of mother, something went into it. I painted from personal experience. It has an emotional quality strong enough to get across in the painting," end quote. He even, open a few more details there. He even made a special frame for the painting. And here you're seeing that frame there where he covered it with an old linen tablecloth. So again, really thinking through these details, that attention to the frame here as well, like what we saw with Francis Fiske Marshall. And that was something that was sort of meant to evoke both the past, but also the idea of the feminine, the woman, and something of the home as well. This idea of home and hearth that's coming through, even in the frame too. So thinking through all of these different details. Nan, his sister, would recall that Grant originally didn't intend to sell this painting. Instead, he wanted his mother to keep it. But she took a little bit more of a pragmatic look and recognized that the family needed the money that could come from selling the painting. And so in 1931, it was purchased by the Cedar Rapids Art Association, which would then become the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. This piece led into the creation of American Gothic in the next year, which would be the fourth painting in this new style that he's moving into. And it sort of confirmed his direction that he was going into. This idea that he was developing a very uniquely American style that was borrowing features of American decorative arts and culture, but historic photographs as well, Victorian ephemera, looking at all of these different references and kind of bringing them all together in his work. This becomes another in his sort of series of icons of the Midwest, similar to Woman with Plants, John B. Turner. And this piece, of course, was an immediate success, and it led to Wood's work being in very high demand going forward. Comparing the two, Wood would repeat some of the decorative motifs that he included in Woman with Plants in American Gothic. We see a snake plant. It might be kind of hard to see, but there's a snake plant at the back of American Gothic sitting on the porch back there. So he's including another of these snake plants. There's also a begonia back there as well. Nan is wearing the brooch that we also see in Woman with Plants. Even the way that she's dressed, the style of dress, feels very similar to how his mother is dressed in Woman with Plants. We've got that rickrack there, the collar that she has of her shirt too. And so different things are being repeated here. He's bringing them forward into American Gothic as well. On his deathbed in 1942, Wood is said to have told Marvin Cohn that he thought Woman with Plants was his best painting, and that he planned to do a matching portrait of his father, which he ended up not being able to live to start. So this is one that really stuck with him. Now we'll move into the 1930s with Victorian survival. And this is a piece that's showing this kind of divide, this gap between the rural Victorian world and the modern urban world. Something that Grant Wood thought about a lot, the changes that he saw taking place, the things that he saw, the progress that he saw being made, but also he would sometimes kind of mourn some of these changes as well. This piece is inspired by 19th century tintype photographs. It's done in these sepia tones. It's meant to look like it is something from the past. He's evoking that with those tones that he's using. The corners are rounded by the custom-made frame to make it look like the shape of one of these old photographs, like a tintype or a daguerreotype. So showing these antique photograph things coming through even the shape of the piece. And here he's representing an image of his great aunt Matilda, who had occasionally looked after the Wood children. It's also kind of a composite of two of his maiden aunts, not only his Aunt Tilly, who you're seeing there on your screen, but also Aunt Sarah. And of course, this was completed long after her death. And we see that although it does appear very similar to the photograph, he's also playing with and accentuating her primness, making her very stiff and very self-contained, perhaps more so than she was in life. It feels almost kind of surprising to see her depicted with a modern telephone there. The telephone almost seems to sneak into the picture plane with her. And it seems to point up at her almost as if it's talking to her, or yelling at her, or about to ring and scare her. And in that way, it seems to mock her. She has a very long neck, which feels sort of parodied by the length of the phone as well. And that's something that he's carrying over from American Gothic too, that elongation that's very much present in American Gothic. She appears reserved and repressed, but the phone seems perky and alive and stretches upward. They feel like two creatures from very different time periods that seem to be at odds. And at the same time, she also kind of physically resembles the telephone too. She's wearing this black dress and the black neckband that she has, and her sort of small rounded head seems to accentuate that resemblance between the two. Although it almost seems to stare up at her and kind of points upward at her, she is very pointedly looking outward directly toward the viewer, seeming to ignore this appliance that's kind of beckoning her, stares forward with her lips kind of smooshed in a line, almost kind of pursed in that way. Here, Wood is kind of wanting us to understand her world as being very upright and private and guided by these strict rules of the late 19th century America, of this kind of Victorian culture. And here you're seeing a detail of the brooch that she wears here too. He's also kind of thinking about the ways in which this generation could cling to their own world and what they were familiar with in the face of oncoming technology and the new generation. It's true, there's definitely humor and satire that's present here and kind of shows his mixed feelings about these certain Victorian types. He was able to kind of see their faults and the ways in which they could be a little excessive, but also at the same time, he recognized that this was a generation or a type of person that was disappearing. And in that way, he became kind of sentimental and memorialized them in his paintings. We know that the Victorian was something that he was interested in and kind of held closely to his heart through the things that he kept, through the things that he surrounded himself with, the collections that he had. At his Iowa City house, you're seeing some photographs from that house here. He furnished the space with mostly Victorian things. And so there may be mockery present in the painting, but at the same time, there's a really strong personal connection with the items of this era and the people of this era too. So in his collections, he had items that were also connected really strongly to his family's history, like a Gothic revival mantle clock, family jewelry, tintype albums, engraved silver spoons, his grandmother's china, and also very personal family mementos, like his mother's mourning veil as well. It's called Victorian Survival, and we see this woman kind of lingering on. Her existence is continuing on, kind of this unassuming presence. But we see that there's kind of this verge of something coming in, a verge of destruction with this advance of communication. This is a piece that can sometimes be interpreted in different ways. For some, they see this confrontation between modernity and Victorian insularity, but for others, the cropped telephone at the left edge can also be a humorous commentary about gossipy women of this era, these kind of rural women who were gossiping. And others thought that perhaps Wood had drawn inspiration from his upbringing with his parents as very rigid Quakers and wondered if that strict formality of his upbringing and the hardships of his youth were being portrayed here through this kind of lens of humor. Both this and Woman with Plants become depictions of these iconic types. With Woman with Plants, we saw the Midwesterner, and here we see these ideas of the Victorian past coming through. It also feels like it anticipates Daughters of Revolution, which would be painted in the following year, and in which he would kind of openly satirize the daughters of the American Revolution, who took issue with the memorial window that you saw a picture of earlier, that was being constructed in Germany. Behind them, Wood places Washington Crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Leutze, a German-born American artist, to kind of point out perhaps the hypocrisy of some of that outrage of having the memorial window constructed in Germany. So he was able to both, love and appreciate his neighbors, but also to see some of the humorous contradictions that were present beneath their exteriors and draw those out and kind of point those out in his work. As Wood was moving into the 1930s, he was starting to use greater calculation and careful planning in his work as he composed his paintings. And it differed from his earlier work, which could be a bit more spontaneous. Even the way that he used his materials was paralleling this progression from loose impressionist sketches and fluid brushwork to much tighter and more refined compositions. He would do preliminary drawings, and they would often be accompanied by considerable research, and that starts to become much more important in the preparation of his finished paintings as he's moving forward. And even his paint manipulation, as we've been seeing, becomes much more controlled and precise. And so that leads us into our next piece, Portrait of Nan from 1933. This is often talked about as his way of sort of making up for American Gothic. He had used Nan as the model for American Gothic, for the woman in American Gothic, and in that painting transformed her into this kind of timeless, ageless archetype for American Gothic, this idea. She had also previously modeled for him as the allegorical figure in the memorial window, and had been used by him as a model in other works as well. And of course, being the model for American Gothic, there was a lot of commentary about that piece, and not all of it was kind to her or to how she appeared in that work. And so in that way, this became a way for him to sort of make up for that. Here, she's depicted as more fashionable, very kind of stylish and contemporary. Wood was so specific in how he wanted her to appear, and again, in this kind of element of the decorative, how she was dressed, that they ended up actually working together to create the top that she's wearing. So Wood cut a potato in half and used that as a stamp to create the polka dot pattern on a bed sheet. Nan then sewed it up into this kind of summery blouse and added the bows that are on her shoulders there as well. Um, this was a piece, and the bows that she added there also kind of connected, made a more cohesive image by sort of mimicking the shape of her hair as well. Those kind of very uniform waves, they seem to kind of echo those scallops that were present there. And the waves of her hair also complemented the arched penciled brows that she had on, and the pronounced rhythm of that polka dot pattern. She has a little trace of a smile here, but it's kind of enigmatic, how she's feeling through her facial expression. Nan was 33 years old here, and she had been married for about 8 years. Grant Wood would spend 8 weeks or so working on the portrait, and these elements of this kind of contemporary, fashionable woman are contrasted by the overall composition, which seems to be kind of inspired or referencing colonial American portraiture. Something sort of like the work that you're seeing on your screen by John Singleton Copley. There are elements here that feel very reminiscent of that era for portraiture. And so here, Wood has depicted Nan in this oval portrait, which was a shape that was definitely in favor with the colonial era and with the Victorian era as well. She's seated on a Hitchcock chair, and there's this green curtain that sweeps behind her and is held by an antique drapery knob. And we see curtains like that in John Singleton Copley's work as well. The Copley work, too, has these kind of attributes that are present on the surface of the desk, and Nan, too, has attributes in her hands. I've got a detail here for you of that curtain and that antique knob that's holding it back. And then these attributes that she holds, a baby chick and a ripe plum. These are interesting because Nan has always insisted that these were chosen for decorative reasons. That the artist just liked the chicken, which Nan had bought at a dime store as a household pet, because he felt like it would echo the color of her hair in the image. And the plum, too, he felt like it would reiterate the shape of the dots in her blouse and repeat the rose color of the wall behind her. So Nan said in her telling of how this all happened, she said, quote, "As I was showing the chick to Grant, I held the plum I was about to eat in my other hand. He said, 'Hold it, that's how I'm going to paint you. The chick will repeat the yellow color of your hair, and the plum will repeat the color of the background,' end quote." And this seems a little unlikely for Grant Wood. He didn't often choose the elements that he included simply for stylistic grounds. If they were these attributes like this, usually there was some other significance that was going on that would lend themselves to the portrait. And so it's possible, and definitely the stylistic things could also have been sort of an added bonus. But the chicken, it's possible, we're seeing here is kind of young and vulnerable. It's held in her cupped hand. And so it could be conveying her tenderness, perhaps. That's one interpretation. The plum, too, there was this existing artistic convention that we see kind of throughout the history of art, where fruit is used as a symbol of femininity or fertility. And so that could also be coming through with the inclusion of that piece. These both are also natural goods, and so they could represent Wood's thoughts about what was beneficial and wholesome about the Midwest. But they've also been interpreted in many different ways. Like I said, a lot of times these are more ambiguous, and so there are more interpretations that come through. This is the only work that in his mature style that the artist would keep for himself. and he would make it the centerpiece of his living room in Iowa City, which you're seeing here, and you're seeing Grant Wood and Nan there in the living room together. He chose elements of the room to complement the colors and shapes in the painting, the floral wallpaper, the dark rose upholstered Victorian gentleman's chair, and even the dark green drapes, which all repeated colors of the painting. Grant would say to Nan, quote, "The portrait is yours whenever you want it. I will never sell it. It's the last portrait I intend to paint, and it's the last time you will ever pose for me," end quote. Nan was confused by this, understandably, and so he explained by telling her that her face was too well known, and he didn't want to type his people in that way. And so he wouldn't be using her again as a model. He did end up sending this piece to the State Fair Art Salon, but for exhibition only. He had won many, many prizes there and kind of felt that it was time to step aside and let someone else win. And Nan, too, said that she really loved the portrait that he had painted of her. She thought of it as showing her just as she was, without distortion and with no attempt to prettify her. But at the same time, again, I said these different interpretations. Viewers who saw this piece, kind of East Coast viewers, had a different sort of view of the piece and thought of it still as another kind of biting satirical commentary. One commentator said, quote, "All the bigotry, stupidity, malice, and ignorance which are rife in the provinces and are Wood's special targets," end quote. And so here too, that relationship that Wood is having with this broader society, which he never really felt a part of, perhaps is kind of fueling some of this speculation and some of these differing interpretations into what Wood is doing. And at the same time, still others would describe this piece as kind of an up-to-date, very modern rural goddess of the farmyard and orchard. And others still would read that inscrutable look on her face, again, as appearing almost like kind of a Mona Lisa there, kind of a Mona Lisa smile present within the piece. And so a lot of different interpretations. This was a small window in which Wood was doing portraits. It's not a form that he continues with later on. He kind of stopped doing portraits around 1933 when his landscape paintings started to consume his interest and his energy. We have two specific portraits here, Frances Fiske Marshall and Nan. And we also have two portraits of a type, while still using a very specific kind of model as a reference, with women with plants and Victorian survival. These are four very different portraits of women, and yet there's still a deep sensitivity that runs through, and also some wit and satire that comes through as well. Two of the portraits were completed after the death of the person depicted, and two were completed from life. Although they are stylistically a bit different, he's kind of figuring out his style throughout that we talked about. There are also through lines in each. In these depictions, women represent the history of families, of places, of a nostalgic past, and a contemporary moment. Wood is realizing his mature style while also using depictions of women to tell the story of how he viewed his surroundings and the moment in time. And so I'll stop there. I hope this has been an interesting conversation for you. And are there any questions that I can attempt to answer here? Stop sharing my screen for a moment.
I really appreciate your analysis and presentation of all that material. It was really wonderfully done, and I'm fascinated that the portraits came to an end and seemingly a means for making money at times. But I love that comment about the portrait of Sally Staymates and 25 if you like it, 50 if you, or 25 if you keep it, 50 for like 75.
Yeah.
And so he did he and he, what was the one that he said he really was his favorite? Oh, his mother's portrait. Yeah, of course,
Yeah.
'cause so what a tight relationship. But do we have any other comments he made about his likes or dislikes of the? I kind of remember him throwing down on some portraiture of his own. I mean, just maybe thinking it commercial. Am I crazy at that?
No, I think you're right. I don't think it was a favorite genre of his. Um, and I think you're right that there are some comments that he specifically made about them. I don't have those in front of me, but I think you're right that he's talked about that. Um, yeah, it was my understanding kind of working on this and reading through that although portraiture was something that kind of really lent itself well to what he was working on and playing with the style that he moved into, I don't think that it was really ever one of his favorites, um, or one of his favorite genres to work in. So yeah, it is very interesting to consider that and how many he ended up doing, and then kind of stopping there too. Yeah, thanks so much.
Well, thank you. Do we know he turned some portraits down, didn't he? Or I mean, do we know that?
I would think so. I don't have I didn't take specific
Yes.
notes on that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure which ones in particular, but that would make sense. Yeah, I'm
Sure, sure.
sure.
Yeah. And did you say that he did start on the portrait of his father?
I don't believe so. It was something that he had
Okay.
in mind, at least on
Yes.
his deathbed, as something that he said to Marvin Cohn as because of that, because of how much he liked Women with Plants, that he wanted to do something similar to depict his father. But at that point, he was already on his deathbed, so I don't believe that was something he ever started.
Well, again, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Appreciate the
thank you. Well, if there are no other questions, then I'll just thank you again so much for joining me today for this Grant Wood in Focus presentation. I really appreciate it. You can always check out more of our Grant Wood in Focus presentations, as well as any of our other Zoom presentations on our YouTube page. So check things out there. Thanks again for joining me and have a great rest of your Sunday today. Bye-bye.